Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about why is my alcohol blurry? First of all, this is good news because that means that it's working, and by working I mean that alcohol is being produced. So whether you're making wine, whether you're making beer or cider or something stronger like rum, vodka, everything needs to start off with the yeast eating the sugar and a liquid. The liquid is where the sugar just sits down peacefully and the yeast just ravages it. This liquid is a must because yeast need a favorable environment to eat the sugar, and this environment is liquid. If you put just yeast and just sugar, put it together, there will be no reaction because it needs water. So make sure the liquid has water. And the majority of liquids, whether it's juice contains water, whether it's water itself and you put sugar in it, the yeast will be eating the sugar. In one of my past batches, I used apple juice as the liquid. And when I poured the apple juice directly in the pan, I added sugar and put up the heat in order to dissolve the sugar. The color was the same. However, it's only once you add yeast and the yeast starts being active that you see a difference in color, because when the yeast eats the sugar, it also produces CO2, and CO2 are bubbles. And once there's a closed environment, bubbles floating around, this will bring the particles up and down. And the particles in play are the yeast.
If you're using dry yeast, it will sink to the bottom of the jar because it is solid and compact, and less air is trapped inside the granules of the yeast, which makes it more dense than liquid.
They start off at the top, however, they sink to the bottom of the jar, and the CO2 brings them to the top of the fermenting jar. And these bubbles will translate to your airlock bubbling on the top of your lid. Let's take the same apple juice example. If your apple juice remains the same color from the beginning to the end of the fermentation without any changes, that means there's something wrong and there's no alcohol that's being made, but it's the same old apple juice with sugar and dead yeast. However, in order to avoid that, one of my past batches, I've had a little issue in having the yeast eating the sugar, so I shook the jar. And that's one of the solutions that you can do if you want to make sure that your alcohol is working. You can either stir it or shake your fermenting jar, and this will lead to your yeast being active and eating the sugar that's available to it. And for those wondering, you do not have to shake your jar every day. You just have to shake it at the beginning to make sure the yeast is active. And if you want to avoid shaking it, let's say you're going on vacation and you want to just make your alcohol, leave, come back and drink it, then you can use a yeast starter. And what a yeast starter is, it's an environment that's favorable to the yeast. Why? Because you put yeast in a container. I would suggest not plastic but glass to avoid any contaminants. You put warm water in there or warm liquid and pitch in the yeast and sugar. The yeast will then be activated, eat the sugar, and once it's been left there for 30 minutes up to 2 days, you can pitch it in the big jar, and the yeast will have already been activated from the beginning once it's inserted in the environment. Therefore, it's just going to continue as it was doing and doesn't have to start eating sugar from scratch. A trick is to use a portion of your big batch and put that in the little dish, so the yeast will already know what environment is waiting for it. You just want to make sure not to add water that's too hot, because I've added water that was too hot in the past in one of my recent batches actually, and this killed off the yeast. And although dead yeast acts as food for alive yeast, because yeast is cannibalistic, I'd rather have my whole pack of yeast than have half alive and half dead that are being eaten. The ideal temperature to pitch in the yeast is in the back of your yeast package. It could range from 26 degrees Celsius to 37 degrees Celsius. However, if it gets too hot, the yeast will die. One trick to make sure that your yeast is working is to add yeast nutrients. There's a little secret in turbo yeast. So the reason why it's called turbo is that it makes your alcohol faster. And in the ingredients of turbo yeast, it includes yeast nutrients. So it's inside the package, and those yeast nutrients are actually dead yeast cells. So the yeast doesn't have to go far to be more active. It just eats its dead counterparts, and this invigorates it and lets it eat more sugar to make more alcohol. And for other secrets like this, book a class below. We'll let you know tons of them in the alcohol making world. Now, going back to the blurry situation, so you want it to be blurry, and when it's blurry, this means that the yeast is doing its job, or in other words, eating the sugar to make alcohol. And at one point, you do not want it to be blurry. It does not affect the taste. However, when you drink alcohol, you'd rather it be transparent. You'd rather see your hand across the jar. And there are two main types of solutions to achieve this goal. So you either achieve it the natural way or the artificial or the sped up way. So me personally, I prefer the natural way, and these includes two components. So you either just wait, you just play the waiting game and let all the yeast sediments just sink to the bottom of the jar, and then you siphon the top part out and leave the bottom part and throw it. You can also cold crash. This is natural, however, it also speeds up your process to remove the blurriness. And why does this help with the blurriness? The yeast will be dormant once it's cold, so we're putting the jar in a cold environment to make the yeast dormant, so the yeast sinks to the bottom faster. So those are your two natural ways. If you want to make it even faster than that, you can have Turbo Clear.
If you look closely at the package, you'll see in part A it removes 90% of the yeast, the solids, and the compounds of the wash. It's pretty good, and it's effective within 24 hours.
You can purchase Turbo Clear. This is also part of the Turbo Yeast manufacturing. And what this is, there's two packages. There's a part A and a part B, and you have to use one, then the other, and it makes all of the sediments sink to the bottom of the jar quickly. Another trick is to use unflavored jello. So this, just warning, I've tried this in the past and it failed. To avoid the same mistakes as I did, I would suggest you watch the video here. And this wash, instead of clearing the alcohol, it turned my alcohol into jello. Therefore, I would not suggest using too much of your unflavored jello. And make sure it's not flavored. Make sure it's Knox, for example. That's a brand where you have unflavored jello. And another option, this one I would highly suggest against, it's using clay. And clay, why? It's because it just grabs all the particles and drags them to the bottom of the jar. And a lot of brewers use this. However, I would personally not drink anything with clay. It sounds a little toxic, and I would not put that in my drink. However, let me know in the comments below if you've used clay. I'd be curious to know if it affected the taste. And I would suggest using natural ways to clear your alcohol, and for the ingredients as well, as a whole. You wouldn't want to put anything that you wouldn't drink yourself from the store. I have a batch here that's blurry. I just want to show you. It's from one of my classes. So as you can see, my hands are not visible across the jar. Therefore, it's currently in the works. The yeast is working, and do not fret if you have a blurry batch. Just leave it time and everything will sort itself out. As long as it tastes good, the blurriness does not affect the taste, it just affects the presentation. And there are multiple ways to visually enhance your alcohol if you want to make it less blurry and more clear that we talked about in this video. So the main parts is really just waiting, or if you're impatient, you can buy products to accelerate the process. And if you found this video valuable, share it with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.